in fact not grown today either. Oats are not grown in Eretz Yisrael. And whether or not there were some oats in Egypt or some other countries at some point, that may well be. There was, as you say very correctly, there was trade, there were imports and exports. But the question is, were these things grown in the ground? Were these things grown here in Eretz Yisrael at the time of the Mishnah? From what we know, the answer is no. It doesn't look like the description of the Talmud Yerushalmi. And Rabbi Nathan Av Yeshiva, who lived here in Eretz Yisrael, who was a Gaon, tells us.
Say anywhere that it was grown?
Shibolet Shu'al, yes, but who says that Shibolet Shu'al is oats?
No, I'm saying, does it say that it was grown?
You're asking you're asking whether all the 5 grains need to be grown in Eretz Yisrael? I think it's a safe assumption. That's what was intended. Yes, more than a safe assumption. And the same is true of rye.
Cultivated.
Yes, cultivated, exactly. It wasn't cultivated then, and it's not cultivated today, because it's not a Middle Eastern grain. It does much better in European climates. Both rye. Why are rye and oats important grains in Europe, particularly in the colder parts of Europe? Because they do very well in cold, wet climates. Wheat and barley do much less well in those same climates, or at least not do equally well. So there's no reason not to grow rye and oats. But it's easier to grow rye and
grown in Eretz Yisrael, not cultivated. I mean growing.
Yes, but they're not used for human consumption. They're not. It's not practical to consume them unless you're really starving.
Okay, so is there any indication in the Bavli or the Yerushalmi that the 5 grains were cultivated for human consumption in Eretz Yisrael? I know you're making that assumption, but do you have any textual reason to assume that assumption?
Well, let me ask you this question. Do you believe it's reasonable to assume that the Mishnah in Sukkah talks about ethrorim? Were ethrorim grown in Eretz Yisrael, or were they imported from Greece, as they were in Europe?
Let's define what
they were cultivated in Eretz Yisrael. They grew on trees in Eretz Yisrael. Yes, clearly, without a doubt.
Let's define what we mean by grown. Okay, I mean wild oats were growing in Eretz Yisrael. That no one disagrees with.
Wild oats
were growing,
sprout up here and there today, also in Eretz Yisrael.
Right. The question is, was it cultivated?
That's exactly the point.
As a food for market.
And as far as
now, we are aware that it was cultivated elsewhere, but what I'm asking is, it exists here. Is there any textual indication from the Bavli or the Yerushalmi that the 5 grains had to be cultivated for sale?
I think
you're assuming that. I understand that.
You can, if you wish, you can call it an assumption. I have no problem with that. Many things in halakha are based on assumptions, reasonable assumptions, and I think it's a perfectly reasonable assumption that the 5 grains, Hameshet Minei Dagan, were commonly cultivated in Eretz Yisrael. I think that's obviously for consumption and for sale and what have you. I think that's more than a reasonable assumption. If you have no indication that a certain grain was cultivated in Eretz Yisrael, I think it makes it very unlikely, or certainly dubious, whether that grain was one of the common grains in Eretz Yisrael. Whereas all indications are that these 5 grains were very common. But we don't have any archaeological evidence that oats were common in Eretz Yisrael at that time, because a whole oat grain, like ancient wheat grains, have been preserved in places like Masada and other places, and because of the dry climate, etc., they can be preserved for thousands of years, and they have been. Just as in the same way as we found in Masada over 2,600 olive pits, which, if you want to discuss the Shiur V'Kazayith, then I'll tell you how significant that is. In the same way, in places like Masada, you find grains of barley, grains of wheat. You don't find grains of oats. You have to ask yourself, why not? We're not talking about 1 or 2 grains. We're talking about huge numbers of grains that were found, hundreds. All these things indicate that these grains, oats and rye, were not apparently known, at least not common in Eretz Yisrael, and they also do not fit the description of Chazal that all these 5 grains are actually 2 grains. That is to say, either a form of wheat or a form of barley. Take the example now of rye. Rashi says that rye, he uses the French term sigla or sigela, the Latin term for rye is secale cereale, which in the picture of it is here. Again, this is a European grain that was not known in the Middle East, so says Professor Felix and others. We're not talking about one opinion, one individual. This was the accepted view, and what I believe is still the accepted view amongst experts.
That it did exist in Egypt, and you go with the people at Columbia, they've got all the evidence for that.
All right. At any rate, the fact is that chiffon, according to Professor Felix and many others, is this grain over here, which is spelt wheat, or just spelt, which is its Latin name is triticum. We said before, triticum is the Latin term for chita. It's known as triticum spelta. It's a variety of wheat, as the Breita tells us. That on the one hand, on the other hand, the taste of the flavor of spelt is similar to seorim. That's why it was mentioned as a type of seorim. Whereas the Mishnah in Kilayim speaks about seorim, shiboret shoal, and kusmin and shipon, enam kilayim ze bazeh. In order not to be kilayim, they have to be very similar. If seorim, shiboret shoal, kusmin and shipon are not kilayim, they have to be very similar. There is almost no similarity between rye and either wheat or barley. So, look, taking all these facts into account. Also, by the way, in Europe, another good example of how this goes back to what we said before. We discussed before how the galuth always results, inevitably, inexorably results in a distortion of the Torah, misunderstandings in the Torah, not just for these technical reasons to do with horticulture and environment, but also for these reasons. Another example of this is that the kusemeth, or kusmin, which is also a variety of wheat, rice wheat in English, or emmer wheat, was understood by many in Europe to be what was called in Yiddish gretschke. Gretschke is buckwheat. Now, buckwheat is not even by any remote stretch of the imagination wheat. You want to see what this plant looks like? I'll show you what it looks like. This is what